Welcome. We are now ready to start to tackle Chapter 7 of this course. Now that we have familiarized ourselves with the generic structure of bone and skeletal tissue, we will be focusing on major bones of the body. And I have included a copy of these two diagrams as your supplementary material on Blackboard, in case you wish to print them and follow along as we cover these over this chapter's activities. But before we start talking about different bones as such, let's remind ourselves about the skeleton. The word skeleton comes actually from Greek word skeletos, which means roughly a dried up body. I think that this description sells the skeleton a bit short because, as we saw in the previous chapter, human skeletal system serves many functions, and this makes it really quite a design and engineering achievement. And I would say that the human skeleton even far bypasses the achievements of a human engineering in steel skeletons of skyscrapers or bridges designs. So, as we remember from the last chapter, skeleton included cartilages, bones, joints, and ligaments. And all of these add up to about 30 pounds on an average sized person. Yet without skeleton and the scaffolding that it forms, much of other systems would not be able to function. But that's not all. I also want to remind you that there are many different kinds of skeletons that we see in the nature. In the case of us humans and many other animals, we see endoskeleton. This is internal support structure located inside the body. Here you see a really nice lithograph, probably from around mid-1800s when things like this were in fashion. And what it shows really is a little of that comparative anatomy that we talked about earlier, that both a human and a horse share many similar bony structures, and it is just the proportions and slight alterations in shape that make them different. But at large, we are very similar. Look at that horse and a human voguing. Or in this where the similar bones are highlighted with more color. But that is not the only kind of skeleton that can exist, of course. You might remember from our BIO201 class the exoskeleton, which was often made of chitin. Many invertebrates share this characteristic. For example, here we see a really nice microscopic picture below of an ant's exoskeleton and nothing else. Remember, it was a bit like the body armor of a medieval knight. Skeleton on the outside of the body. But have you come to think about this? Also, leaves of plants have a skeleton. Here we see a vein skeleton structure of a leaf. And how this picture was achieved is because veins contain lignin that make them harder to decompose by microorganisms. So you can often see them in the fall, especially where I'm from. And finally, I want to mention Hydra skeleton, which is sometimes called also a hydrostatic skeleton. These are flexible skeletons that result from a fluid pressure. They are especially common among simple invertebrate organisms. And of course, cytoskeleton, you should have learned about that in your BIO201 as the scaffolding and transport structure inside the animal cell in the cytoplasm of a cell. This complex network of interlinking filaments was very important. And this is actually a real picture of cells with fluorescent dyes. Note how the protein filaments shown on green are running all through the cell space. They give it its structure and an internal transport mechanism. So this week we will be focusing on bones that make this skeleton. And instead of us trying to cover all of these all at once, I would like to approach the skeleton by our already familiar division into axial and appendicular body. So let's start with the axial skeleton. Here you can see some of the major bones that we will cover, but there will be much more detail. So let's get started. For the axial skeleton, we will be considering three main areas, which altogether contain about 80 bones. These areas include the skull, which is made of the cranium and the facial bones. The vertebral column, with its cervical, thoracic, and lumbar regions, and sacrum and coccyx. And of course, the bony structures of the chest, known as thoracic cage. We will be starting with the skull in a bit, but before that, I wanted to briefly discuss the functions of the axial skeleton. First of all, axial skeleton forms the longitudinal axis of the body. By this I mean that it really is what the superior-inferior axis of the body is formed by. It carries the weight from the head all the way to the feet, giving us humans a cylinder shape, if you wish. It is really, if you think about it, how us humans are formed. One long cylinder from the head to the feet, through which many systems and processes pass, either completely or at least part of the way. Well, the second function is to support the structures of axial body. The head, the neck, and the trunk. So the axial skeleton is what gives the structure, scaffolding shape, and so on for these structures. And finally, if you think about it, the brain, the spinal cord, and vital organs within the thoracic cage are protected by the bony structures of the axial skeleton. So these are our three functions of the axial skeleton. Now we are ready to look at the skull in more detail. If you look at the skull, it is made of many flat bones that are firmly locked together at the most of the parts. These are sutures, zigzag-like junction of two adjacent bones. And they are immovable junctions in an adult with the exception of the jaw. The skull is made of two sets of bones. The cranium, which contains enclosed the brain and a cranial cavity, and provides attachment point for the muscles of the head and neck. And the facial bones, which is really the framework of the face, contains the special sensory organs such as sight, taste, and smell, and provides passageways for the air and food through the openings in it, as well as gives us the attachment points for the muscles of facial expression, which is of course important for communication amongst other things. Let's look at the cranial bones a little more. Here we can see that the cranium is made of these 8 bones. The tiny ethmoid bone, which forms a part of the base and boundary of the eye socket on both sides. And the covering most of the anterior surface of the skull, we have frontal bone. Then at the very back, this being the posterior part of the skull, occipital bone. On that, please note that there are small bumps at the inferior aspects of it. These are attachment sites for many important muscles of the back. And we have 2 parietal bones. They are separated by a suture that runs on a mid-sagittal plane, separating to right and left side. Most of the sphenoid bone is hidden in this diagram inside the skull. And finally, we have temporal bones on both sides, lateral to the skull. Notice that there is an opening for the auditory canal of the ear there, and also note how the mandible joins with the temporal bone, forming what we call temporal mandibular joint or TM joint of the jaw. Okay, that was a lot to take in. Next, I want us to take a step back and look a bit more of the cranium on a general level. Let's look at the cranium a bit more. Cranium can be divided into two parts at large: cranial vault and base. So the vault is, if we are using our anatomical language here, the more superior and lateral and posterior part. And it also includes the forehead. The base of cranium instead is the more inferior part. And let's look at this base a bit more in detail. So here we have a view looking down into the skull with the very superior parts removed. Let's see what we can see inside here. So we notice that the cranium contains many openings, in fact 85 of those. These include, for example, the opening for the spinal cord to go through from the end of the brainstem, this big hole that you can see being called foramen magnum, which actually means in Latin a big hole. There are also openings for the auditory canals, structures to the external ear, and for the nose to the nasal cavity, and for example for the optic nerves to enter the orbits inside where the eyes are. So many kinds of openings. And what you will notice is that often these names include terms like foramen or foramina, canals, and so on. And you will also have many nerves and blood vessels going through these openings. In particular, when we get to the cranial nerves later on in our studies, we can follow the path of each cranial nerve through specific openings of the base of skull. And I included this diagram just because it is a good transition to what I want us to look at next. Here we have a frontal section of the skull showing major cavities. And really what you see is that there is a lot of empty spaces there inside the skull, which all have their own functions. So next, we should look at these joints that connect the bones of the skull. Remember, these were immovable as they are tightly interlocked in an adult, and they were called sutures. First, here is the coronal suture. It runs following, roughly speaking, the coronal plane, and you will see that it separates the parietal and frontal bones. The second one is going to be the sagittal suture. This, of course, separates the right and left parietal bones. Now, here's a fun word. Lambdoid suture separates the occipital bone from the parietal bone and continues a little down even with temporal bone. Finally, the squamous suture. This separates temporal bone from the parietal bone. And here is a good summary of these if you wish to have all this information on one slide. Now, this next one is not something that you have to learn, but a weird anatomical oddity that I just wanted to mention. Because anatomy is often not as black and white as your textbook leads you to believe. On some people, there are actually what we call sutural bones. These are small, irregularly shaped bones within the sutures, and we still are unclear of their meaning, as some have them and some don't. And certain conditions are associated with them. But what I wanted to mention, this in case you are ever faced with them and wonder, hey, I was never told about this at school. See, the anatomy is fascinating and there is so much more to discover and understand. So it is very much an active field where much research is still being done. Isn't anatomy cool? Okay, let's return back to our earlier division of the skull. So we had cranial and facial bones. And now it's time for us to look a bit more of the facial bones. So there are 14 bones of the face. And I want to go through with them with you. And let's start with the inferior nasal concha. There are 2 of these on each side of the face, and these are the ridges inside the nasal region. And we will talk more about them on the respiratory system. But this is a nice figure to illustrate them. Next, I want to mention lacrimal bones, palatine bones, and vomer. These are all small bones of the face, and we will not go into more detail about them. Mandible, however, is going to be the next one that we will look at. Mandible is the largest and strongest bone of the face. It is U-shaped. Here we see a lateral view of it, but I'm certain you can use your imagination to see the shape. So there are few parts that I want to highlight, especially. First of all, the angle. And this can be seen prominent especially on some men. And then coronoid process. This is the more anterior one of the 2 superior ends of the mandible. It serves as an insertion point for a large temporalis muscle, which you will learn more about later in this course. Now, let's look at the more posterior of these 2. This is condylar process. It forms the temporomandibular joint, also known as the TM joint of the jaw. And in fact, this is not a very good bony fit for a lot of the time. So muscles largely contribute to the stability of this joint, and in some people like myself, the TM joint is naturally weak. And the jaw can even fall off from its socket. This is why I do not really eat anything where I have to take a big bite of the food like hamburgers. But enough about me. What else do we have? Well, here is body of the mandible. This is the major part, and in there you can see the alveolar processes. They contain the sockets for the roots of the teeth. And fun fact, if you wish, this is why it's important to have some sort of teeth there. Otherwise, alveolar process part of the mandible will wear off. And if you have ever seen a person with no teeth, their face and mouth region in particular seems a little like it would have collapsed, right? But with dentures, or saving the root of the teeth on alveolar processes, the face will look much more typical to what we are used to seeing. Okay, finally there are 2 openings, or foramina as we call them in anatomy, in mandible. The mandibular foramina is where the nerves run in the medial aspect, and mental foramina where both nerves and blood vessels run through in the more anterior chin aspect. So those are some important parts of the mandible. Next, let's look at maxilla. These bones are just above the jaw and form the majority of the facial skeleton. Notice also how the nasal bones form the bridge of the nose, while the most of the anterior part, the tip, is cartilaginous. So there we have the 14 bones of facial skeleton, 12 of which are paired, leaving the mandible and vomer as the only single bones. And this slide, I think, nicely summarizes the bones of the skull. That has been a lot that we have covered so far, and I am going to highlight a few other structures very briefly. Notice that below the skull, at the neck, we have one more interesting bone that we should be highlighting, the hyoid bone. Interestingly, this bone does not articulate with other bones. It is rather ligaments and muscles that hold it in place. And the one reason why I wanted to mention it for us is that this has specific forensic significance. Often, but not always, if one has been strangled, the act of strangulation may end up breaking this bone. So it is something that we would check for in a cadaver. I'm also going to highlight two more points before we wrap up this video. Firstly, it can get very busy in terms of the bones involved at the area of an orbit. Here we have the right orbit. And let's look at it as a diagram. So you can see that 7 different bones contribute to forming the orbit. Quite busy, huh? All of these structures contribute to holding the eye, muscles, nerve innervation, and lacrimal gland, that is the tear gland, of course. And secondly, I want to introduce just briefly the paranasal sinuses. We will be talking more about them when we study the respiratory system, but they are these small holes in bones of the skull. But several reasons have been proposed for having them. For example, lightening the skull, so making it lighter to carry our head. Voice resonance, involvement in the immunity, and finally, probably the most creative hypothesis, them working as a shock absorber, similar to how cars' nose collapses when in an accident. As I said, we would be talking more about this in the later parts of your A&P studies. So this is it for our first video. In the next video, we will continue looking at the axial skeleton, and after that we will move on to the appendicular parts. Thanks for having joined me on this one.